Scripting for the Web, WS300, Platt College. Introduction to jQuery. jQuery is the most popular JavaScript library on the web, and in today's lecture, you'll see that it makes coding easier. As I mentioned before, jQuery makes things a lot easier. All of the methods have a simple way to achieve a variety of common JavaScript developer tasks consistently across all major browsers and without fallback code. jQuery's tagline is "Write less, do more." As such, the people who developed jQuery wanted to create a library that is the web developer's best friend. These are the main areas of focus that they pinpointed to be the greatest use to people like you and me. This slide is taken directly from our class book. These are the points of focus that I just mentioned. The ability to select elements, the ability to perform tasks, and the ability to handle events consistently and easily. So what is jQuery? From the W3 schools, jQuery is a lightweight JavaScript library. The purpose of jQuery is to make it easier to use JavaScript on your website. jQuery takes a lot of common tasks that require many lines of JavaScript code to accomplish and wraps them into methods that you can call with a single line of code. jQuery also simplifies a lot of the complicated things from JavaScript, like AJAX calls and document object model manipulation. As we have seen in this class, DOM manipulation can get complicated. These bullet points define a number of benefits from using jQuery. In addition, jQuery has plugins for almost any task that you would want to achieve on your website out there. jQuery is an extension of JavaScript. It utilizes JavaScript itself to perform many of its methods, so that you can say that jQuery does the heavy lifting for us. By using pre-written functions, we don't have to write those functions ourselves, and this is one of the reasons it is so widely used. The slide says over 1/4 of the web, but it's probably a fair amount more than that, because WordPress itself has it as part of their package, and WordPress is at least 1/4 of the web. More than likely, jQuery is also part of the various website builders as well, because it is so very useful for the types of things that we do as web developers. As web designers and developers, we are used to using the Document Object Model API and selecting elements with CSS. We don't have to learn JavaScript methods like getElementById, and this is why I have been pushing the Query Selector and Query Selector All methods over the older ones. You already know how to select HTML elements with CSS selectors. Since it is so widely used, you can find support for it all over the web, not just in its own documentation pages. And the documentation on jQuery's site is robust as well. The only problem with the documentation is that it can get a bit techno-babbly, meaning that it is good for developers to read and understand, but not so much for people who are learning. Much like Mozilla's developer network, where JavaScript is highly documented, I recommend that you look at the W3 schools, as they are more interested in educating than documenting. Their explanations and examples will be simpler, and it is meant to help you understand versus giving you all the technical details that a seasoned developer would need or want. Last but not least, jQuery offers up a no-conflict mode that allows you to use a different variable other than the scalar, that's the $, as its shortcut. There are other JavaScript libraries that also use the scalar as a shortcut. jQuery has this no-conflict mode that allows you to use more than one library on the same page. As an example, Cache is a JavaScript library that does much of the same sort of things as jQuery, and it uses the scalar as a shortcut to reference its code library. To use these two things together, you would have to put jQuery into no-conflict mode. We're not going to cover that very much in this class because we're only going to be utilizing jQuery. This is what the jQuery selector looks like. So when I ask you to write a jQuery selector, I will be specifically asking for the scalar and the set of parentheses. What goes inside the parentheses is the valid CSS selector that we will use to target what elements we need, and that is its argument. The jQuery selector can be used for more than just selecting elements, but that is how we're going to be using it 90% of the time. We can use any CSS selector to target elements. You can use first child, last child, nth expression, not, attribute selectors, and so forth. You can be as broad or as specific as you want with the selector, but it must be a valid CSS selector because it utilizes the Document Object Model's API, that is the same one that CSS uses, to target elements. The other part of this is once we create a jQuery object, we need to use jQuery methods on that jQuery object. We cannot use straight JavaScript on those items anymore. Kind of like how I mentioned that you can't store liquid in a phone, I can't put coffee in my phone, and I can't use my coffee mug to make phone calls. Straight JavaScript objects can't utilize jQuery methods either, and need to be put into a jQuery object wrapper, and you would do that with the jQuery selector. And jQuery objects, likewise, can't use vanilla JavaScript methods. The ability to use CSS selectors was one of the big reasons that jQuery had been used so much in the past. This was created before ES6, and so the query selector and query selector all were not part of the standard for JavaScript in browsers. jQuery provided an easier way to select elements. If you remember from days prior, we used document.getElement by ID and sometimes document.getElement by tag name, and now we're able to utilize document.querySelector and document.querySelector all. This was not available before. It is only available in modern browsers, and so we're talking about browsers that are from 2015 and before. So at this point, it would be very rare for someone to have a browser that did not support the query selector method. So this is more on slide 3, a little more detail as I mentioned before on the previous slide. jQuery allows you to simplify these tasks that are listed in the bullet points on the slide, and allows you to write less code to achieve those tasks. For example, jQuery's each method allows us to iterate over each item in an array, an HTML collection, or a node list. And you can perform a document object model manipulation more easily. You can add and remove elements. As we've seen, JavaScript by itself is a little more tricky to add a new element to the document object model. And in the coming days, we'll use jQuery's append method, which allows us to add an element to the end of a container, or if we use the prepend method, we can add an element to the beginning of a container. And this ability to change source order, add new elements, are one of the ways that we will be making slideshows. jQuery has methods to handle events that are consistent and easy to understand because of that consistency, and we'll be going over those next week in more detail. We can also trigger elements to fade in or out of view with JavaScript animations. And have I mentioned Ajax? Sometimes you need something that is complicated, but jQuery's load method is one of the more simple Ajax methods, and it allows you to get HTML from a different document and insert it into your page without reloading. Ajax is something that I very much hope to cover in class in more detail. Another great feature of jQuery is its ability to determine how things work in different browsers. It determines the best way to work based off of the feature support from the browser itself. And this slide is just one example. The two JavaScript examples on this slide are pre-ES6 examples. Remember, we also have the query selector and query selector all that allows us to utilize CSS style selectors like jQuery does. In the vanilla JavaScript lines of code, you can see that we are accessing the element's value property, and in the jQuery code, we are utilizing the .val method to do the same thing. This slide shows another example of how to do things with jQuery versus straight JavaScript. We've done things in this class where we've gotten the class list and set it to a new value. We can also use a new method on the class list property called add, as you can see in this slide as well. We can add a class to an existing list of classes. It used to be that you would have to add the class to the class list values, then reset the class list attribute to the new set of class list values. ES6 has made things a lot better and easier, and I think that that is partly due to jQuery's influence. On the last line, as you can see, that jQuery line of code seems a little more straightforward. On this slide, you can see some code that I wrote to mimic jQuery's fade out method. And you can see that we're kind of going through this process where we're iterating the opacity of the element until it gets to 0 over and over and over. We're checking against the element. jQuery does this in a lot less code because the code that would do this fade out animation has already been written for us with the fade out method. So in summary, I would like to say that jQuery is a powerful extension of JavaScript. It lets us use the selectors we already know as web designers and developers. It handles events for us. It makes common tasks easier for us, things like hiding elements and showing elements and animating elements. It makes it easy to loop through multiple elements. It handles AJAX requests and makes document object model manipulation easier. So this is why developers love jQuery.